Perfecting and Reforming Personal Religion, Chapter 21, Breakdown, entitled The Devotion of the Wise. And this chapter title is fitting because the previous chapter, harping on the living God's fear, ended by stating the living God's fear leading up to the self-regulating action or to a self-regulating character that the conversation may possess or is to possess through an experience with the living God's fear, which fear is wisdom. Which fear is wisdom. The living God's fear is a wisdom. It is a wisdom to be experienced. It is a wisdom to examine. It is a wisdom to reflect on and to assist in human and devotional growth and development. When once the fear of the Lord becomes the center of the conversation, and what that means is when once the words linking to the particular saying, the particular philosophy, the particular wisdom of the living God's devotional character, when that becomes the center, well, then something is supposed to take place. One then has the fear of the living God, and then possessing the fear of the living God, one then becomes in possession of a wise form of devotion. And what is a wise form of devotion? Well, first of all, this chapter opens up by touching on the conversation, what it is. So from the beginning chapter up until this point, this one term conversation has been used repetitively. Like, can't get away from this term because this term conversation highlights a central aspect of the experience. So, having not touched on this before, this chapter opens up with the conversation, what is it? And it explains the conversation as being our behavior or our address or our demeanor or the management of ourself in light of our experience with the Bible's words. So when it comes to our conversation is just exactly that. How the conversation's self is managed in light of its experience with the Bible's words and with the acquired wisdom or philosophy that one through that experience has retained. So our conversation is our walk of life, you could say, so to say. There are different walks of life out there, different specifications, different acknowledgments of where one fits, where one should be categorized. Each one of those fittings, each one of those categorizations, they all come with a specific walk of life for a specific environment. And when you're in that environment, that walk of life is your conversation. So, putting that simply, the devotional conversation is the way or the manner, the behavior of the individual conversation in light of the wisdom retained from it experiencing the words within the scriptures. And so the experience that we have, it is to be reflected from how we portray our conversation self. And that portrayal is however you want to think. There is a public portrayal demonstrated in churches through rituals and such. There is a private portrayal that may be different according to different people, wherever they are in their journey, whoever they are. Everything is particular to the environment and to the person, and nevertheless, it all equals the same thing, our conversation. And so when it comes to putting the living God's fear into practice, and when it comes to exercising self within that experience, what is supposed to arise and what the Bible hopes to have arise within us is the nature of our conversation. Our conversation's self and character. From chapter 1 until now, the Bible has been strict to the experience because it is due to that strictness that the conversation is to develop discipline. And it is the discipline that the conversation develops that is supposed to translate into an experience, allowing the human being to have an example, to see where it is and is not, and to take knowledge of the character that it should possess. So everything, it falls down to our human being. The experience is supposed to educate our human being, but first, in order for that to take place, our conversation needs to be refined. And a refined conversation, that it can be perfect and patient and needing nothing or in want of nothing, our conversation has to get used to a particular train of thought. That train of thought, again, the fear of the living God, which is again a specific wisdom. Now, what is this beginning wisdom entitled the fear of the living God? Well, this chapter goes into that. And then going into that, it explains that the conversation is supposed to have an experience reflecting the illustration found at the crucifixion. So the center of this wisdom, the center of the fear of the living God, it's found at the crucifixion. But how? Well, making sense of this from how Paul breaks it down. And how does Paul break that down? Break down that center. Paul lets us know that in Galatians 3:13, he quotes Moses, "He that is hanged is accursed of God." And so, if we're going to look at that body that is suspended and crucified as a literal blessing, this body is supposed to be our salvation now. Well, according to the Bible's mind, if we're going to apply that, we're wrong for thinking so. Again, why? Because he that is hanged is accursed. The crucified one is accursed. Everything concerning that crucified individual is accursed. That body is cursed. There is no salvation in that body. How that body can get transformed into a body of salvation, it can only happen through error. And very great, blatant error. Because you would have to defy the very principle that is already written within there. And to do that, you're just creating your own, deity and religion at that point. You're stepping away from what is actually contained for our understanding what's happening within the scriptures, and inventing something that is contrary to the scriptures. So to see that crucified body and to take that crucified body as being a sign of salvation, and the instrument used thereon for crucifixion as a sign of salvation and of redemption, it's actually wrong according to the Bible's mind. That is not an instrument of salvation. That is not a body to be admired. There is nothing majestic about what's going on there. Nothing. Because it is accursed. And I'm sure we're familiar with how it is written in the Numbers. What God has cursed is cursed. What God has not cursed, he is not cursed. Who can reverse what God has cursed or blessed? This is actually in the Bible. Actually, this is not a word-for-word quote, but the words are there. Who can reverse what God has blessed, it says. And I will say, who can reverse what has been cursed? So Paul is putting this passage into his explanation of what that crucifixion means, because he's wanting the reader, he's wanting his audience to look beyond what is physically there. What is physically there is accursed. What is physically there does not deserve your worship or time at all, because it's worthless. The one hanging and crucified is worthless. Paul has this there for the reader to look beyond what is physically there. And what is beyond what is physically there is an illustration captured within what is physically there. And so, holding John 4:24 true, God is a spirit. Paul, knowing this, because of course the writings of that author that wrote the author of the book of John were not yet invented, nevertheless Paul knows this. And Paul, knowing this, understands that what he's seeing cannot strictly be held to a physical context. When he's seeing this, knowing that the living God is not physical, but is mind, is without body, physical flesh, understands that the illustration, if truly given and happening according to plan, that physical body figuratively represents something more than what it is. And it does. Paul lets us know. And what he lets us know is true. That physical body represents a physical act, a physical deed. It represents a physical religious philosophy, or an actual religious philosophy. It represents the philosophy of the religious law. Now, the philosophy of the religious law is a philosophy stating one taking their righteousness, their piety, their decency, their charity, their respect, their everything, from doing handwritten deeds and acts, both ancient and modern, passed down. The crucifixion of this body means the crucifixion of such a religious experience. This is why, before Paul quotes Moses, "He that is hanged is accursed of God," Paul plainly writes, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. So here Paul is making sense in a correct way and in at right time of the illustration of the crucifixion, not being the man hanging there is your savior. No, that's not what that means in that context, because the one crucified actually means nothing to the living God. That means nothing. In reality, that hanging body, that crucified flesh, actually symbolizes the religious philosophy of an approach to the living God. When we see that body crucified, we see that approach crucified. No longer are deeds and acts, baptisms, rites, theories and commandments passed down from theologians and such necessary to approach the living God. What is now necessary is what that risen body now represents. And that risen body now represents, still, it is the same body, yet it is separated from where it was crucified. Meaning, it is the same conversation separated from what it is crucified from. And the conversation crucified yet separated from the philosophy of the religious law is a conversation that is liberated or freed from the philosophy of the religious law to now perceive and experience the words of the scriptures for themselves personally. And so there's a shift in experience here. There's a shift in experience. The shift is the conversation was once servant to deeds and acts, to rituals and routines, to ceremonies and theories, and to commandments and baptisms and so forth. Policies of an approach. With the conversation separated from that now and risen from that former conversation, the conversation is now transcending that, meaning entering into the realm of what God, quote unquote, God is. And if God is a spirit, so the conversation now becomes spirit. Meaning again, that instead of relying on what is handwritten, instead of relying on the physical stuff, well, the conversation is now engaging its own thoughts and feelings in an experience that is intimate and that is personal, for the purpose of gaining wisdom and understanding, not just of its own self, but of the devotional character it is mimicking, which is the living gods, the creators. And that's why this chapter, the devotion of the wise, is so interesting and matters. Because the illustration of the crucifixion actually talks about the correct manner of devotion the conversation should be having at this present time. No longer should the conversation remain relying on deeds and acts and such. The crucifixion of that actually categorizes that approach as quote unquote sin. And that is something this chapter lightly touches on, as the previous chapters do, and of course we'll build up to more. But hereafter, once that the crucifixion takes place, and then you see the death of what is nailed to it, and what is nailed to it, again, should not be thought of as a literal man, but should be thought of as a philosophical approach to the living God, the philosophy of the religious law. Seeing this crucified, now there's a bit of reflection, because lifestyle changes. Lifestyle changes because you go from an approach that was handwritten and that was based off of routine. So now the conversation is free to fail and to succeed and to learn and to apply and to adapt through trial and error for the purpose of wisdom. So there was not a real experience that was through routines and such before, because you were justified, quote unquote, through the routines that you did, and it was by the feeling that those routines gave you that your belief was made real. Well, now it's different. Now the new covenant promise comes in, and the new covenant promise is, I will write my words and my law in your heart and in your mind. And this engraving cannot be expected to be physical, because there is no God doing this. There is no God doing this physically. This is an inward and a mental work. The engravings to take place on the heart and within the mind. So the conversation has to move on, has to die, and then move on to its afterlife. Not when the human being has expired, but while the heart is still beating. That's why Paul to the Ephesians says, put off your former conversation and be renewed in the spirit of your mind and put on the new man. The conversation has to die, just as in the illustration, the body died, the conversation died, and then the conversation revived, meaning our conversation has an afterlife now that it must know. And in that afterlife, the spirit of its mind is, as the book says, the new Ark of the Covenant, forwarding the experience. So it's all about transition, and it's all about understanding how and why the transition is. The Bible wants its students and wants the conversation focused on its philosophy, to have an experience that is so intimate and that is so personal that it doesn't need anything to remind it of its own self. The former conversation relied on feeling to feel its belief. The former conversation relied on theory to make it feel as though it was intelligent. Well, now there's a new conversation, and feeling isn't the main stimulus, because feeling is deceptive. The new conversation is to thrive on the renewal of the spirit of its thoughts and feelings. And it does that by reviewing and putting into practice the fear of the living God, or the wisdom of the living God, which wisdom is found at the center of the crucifixion and involves an understanding of the transitioning conversation. And that's basically what this chapter is about. This chapter is about allowing the reader to know that their conversation needs to transition, because there is a manner of devotion that is to the wise conversation, a manner of devotion that is for the wise conversation. And to the wise conversation, as Paul advises and as should be done, that conversation relying on deeds and acts, images and rituals and so forth, that is flesh-based and that is for the physical feeling of it all, to manipulate the mind into believing it's something credible. Well, that if we're living by that illustration, if we're taking that illustration of the crucifixion to be something relevant, well then, just as that body died, and that body symbolizing a religious approach through the philosophy of the religious law to the living God, just as that body is now dead, well, so too is our conversation dead that was alive by the same means. And so seeing that body dead, our conversation now also must die to what that body represents. And seeing that body revive, our conversation must revive to what that body now represents. And that body now represents a conversation that is taken away from the former approach to the living God, to now have an experience for wisdom and for consistently exercising faith on that wisdom and knowledge gained for the bettering of the living experience and for the bettering of the human condition. So when this chapter is saying the devotion of the wise, this is the main devotion of the wise. This is the devotional character and conversation of the individual that would be wise for inward health, and that would be wise for how to maintaining that inward health safely.